Made Untamed is the catchphrase that Toyota uses to describe its GR Corolla GTS hatchback. It's arrived with fat hips, a hard-boosted 3-cylinder engine and all-wheel drive to stake its claim for the mantle as king of the mainstream hot hatches. The Toyota's main competitor is this, the Hyundai i30N, which has earned a reputation as offering the biggest bucks for inconsiderable money and a car that's earned cult status over the last 5 years. It prefers a classic turbo 4-cylinder front drive format, and our premium DCT version arrives with a catchphrase, "Let's play." And we most certainly will today. We'll chase their red lines to find out which of these two offers the most fair weather fun, but also assess their all-round capabilities, as that's the way most owners will use them. But before we turn a wheel in anger, let's touch on pricing. Chasing cars, honest reviews of your next car.
Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
The i30 Premium DCT with sunroof, as it's officially called, clocks in at $53,700 or around $58.5 grand on roads. That said, swapping out the 8-speed dual clutch transmission for a conventional 6-speed manual will shave $3 grand off the bottom line. The GR Corolla GTS for its part is quite a bit more expensive at $62,300 or around $67.5 grand drive away. Unlike the Hyundai, it's only available as a 6-speed manual, so like for like gearboxes, it's $11,600 more expensive. However, on test here, because our i30 is a dual clutch, that difference narrows to $8,600. So it'll be interesting to see whether the Corolla is worth the extra splurge, given it's only got 75% of the cylinder count and twice the driven wheels as the Hyundai. And the Hyundai is where we're going to start, so let's hit the road. Critics and owners alike have been gushing about the i30N's capabilities for half a decade now, but it really hit its stride both literally and figuratively in its update in 2021. It's then that engineers upgraded the standard engine to the performance spec 206 kilowatts and 392 newton meters, and at the same time adding the long-awaited dual clutch transmission. Fun really begins when you skip over the left blue button, which toggles between eco, normal and sport drive modes, and starts when you dive onto the right button, which activates the hotter N and N custom modes. Against a stopwatch on our test track, the i30N makes decent use of its launch control to nail the best of a 5.59 second pass. That's just 9/100ths off Hyundai's claim. There's energy enough for the 2-litre that when you really do bury the throttle exiting on a corner, the electronically controlled front LSD is set into working overtime. It is a 2-mode switchable front diff, but no matter how you set it, there still is a fairly hellacious amount of torque steer. And in fact, you really need to hang on for it to track in the chosen trajectory. Lively, you bet, and that's pretty much its default character when you do uncork the i30N on a back road. The steering is, well, quite funny because in normal mode and around town, it's really too heavy. Once you start chasing the red line, it strangely becomes alive and alert and fizzy. That fizziness is matched by an equally tenacious front end that is actually really quite urgent and alert off center. It's matched by fairly tenacious front end grip, but it's not without its limitations. You fire a little too enthusiastically into the corner or bury the throttle too hard on corner exit and those Pirellis will start to cry freedom. Thankfully, the Hyundai will tuck its nose at even the lightest lift and rotate its tail. And in fact, the change of direction of the i30N is downright stunning. The adaptive suspension offers 3 modes in normal, sport and sport plus, but you can interpret that as firm, firmer and really downright rigid. It really does seem like the N division spent a lot of time just making this car feel like a road rally rocket. And so much of its liveliness really comes down to 2 elements: the torque steer under power and a lot of the vertical movement and shimmying that the chassis does in the mid-corner. At once it feels playful but slightly unhinged, but not in a bad way. The dual clutch is excellent, particularly in manual mode. It's sharp and alert, although it's not quite as rifle bolt assertive as you might find in the Mercedes AMG A45S. In auto mode, the dual clutch does have a tendency to upshift a little bit too eagerly, too quickly. But on balance, it's a faithful ally when you're having a pretty hot punt. There's a certain signature raspiness to the exhaust note of the i30N that really never gets old, but frankly, this machine can drum up so much tyre roar that it almost overwhelms that wonderful soundtrack. You also get that wonderful crackling snare drum roll on the overrun that's really become part of the i30N's signature canon. Braking too is strong and very confidence inspiring, despite the fact that Hyundai doesn't really fit exotic 4-piston front hardware. In a nutshell, the i30N simply loves to pile on the theatre and the fanfare, and it does so at a pace that's palatable on a back road. You don't really need to drum up racetrack pace for this Hyundai to really come alive. Of course, you can fiddle around with settings in its myriad functions to tailor the character to your personal taste, but in general, as a default, this N has a real attack style character to it, and that does extend through to the daily driving experience. So while it does have true hot hatch spirit, and that the more you dig in, the more that it gives back to you, it does feel a little too highly strung everywhere that you drive it. And that's probably its biggest downfall. Right, let's jump into the GR Corolla and check that out. Call me an old Luddite, but I was originally skeptical as to whether or not 1.6 litres and 3 cylinders was really up to the task at hand. But boy, can this little 3-pot alter your misconceptions really, really quickly once you're on the road. At 221 kilowatts, it outpunches the larger 2-litre Hyundai by 15 kilowatts. When you do first set off on the Corolla though, you can get lulled into the sense that it really is a bit of a softie. And that's really because compared to the Hyundai, it is generally more comfortable and measured, particularly when it comes to things like steering weight and ride quality. Then you activate sport mode and then sink your right foot into the carpet, and then out come the surprises. This engine feels much larger than its 1.6 litre capacity suggests. It feels bigger and it sounds bigger too. Quite miraculous though is the low to mid-range torque. The tractability of the thing is not only remarkable, but at times it does feel like it's even got more low-end response than the i30. With track mode on, zero mechanical sympathy applied, the GR Corolla peeled off a best of 5.29 seconds. That's bang on its maker's claim and 3/10 up on the i30N. The manual too is a real gem. The throw is short, the gating is tight, and you can really slam through it when you're up it for the rent. Wanted out to redline, and the energy does seem to taper off a little bit in the top end, but part of that is probably in response to how strong it does feel in the mid-range. One down mark though is the tachometer. So in normal mode, you get a conventional round L, but activate sport and you get a bar format that groups 0 to 4,000 RPM right in the left-hand side of the bar, which leaves a wide breadth for 4,000 right through to 6,000 RPM at redline. The thing is this engine's so towy and tractable. The roll-on response means that on road, you spend a lot of time between 3,000 and 4,000 RPM, largely making the tacho redundant. And it's not helped by the fact that sometimes the tyre roar can almost completely overwhelm the exhaust note. The exhaust note is quite rich and satisfying, but the grumble is that as you go into the hotter drive modes, it really doesn't get much louder. And when you do back off around town, there's a really bassy boom that resonates throughout the cabin. Those noisy tyres are Yokohama Advan Apexes, and they're like a semi-slick design, and the grip that they provide, cold or hot, is absolutely tenacious. And they're matched to a chassis that's surprisingly nailed down and settled, even if you're on a particularly hot pace out on a public road. In short, if you're not wringing its neck at track speed, it's not nearly as lively as the Hyundai. However, outright point-to-point pace is pretty much equal between the two competitors. Compared to the i30, the Corolla's nose isn't as darty and nervous off-center. Its steering is more linear and more measured, and what that does afford is a little bit more accuracy. What I don't like though is that the fluidity in the steering that you do get in normal mode does become a bit dull and overly weighty when you activate sport. Compared with a vibey i30, the Corolla's steering does feel a bit artificial. Of course, you can go into custom mode and apply normal steering feel to a sporty chassis, but it just goes to show you where the GR engineers' heads were at when it came to tuning the feel of the car. Does the GR Corolla's all-wheel drive system really bring that much to the party? Well, in the dry and on a public road, frankly, not all that much. However, one thing that it does do is it does seem to filter out the excessive torque steer that you do find in the i30N. That's not to say it doesn't have an effect on the character of the car. You can actually adjust the center differential, which shifts the torque split from 60-40 front rear to 30-70, which does help the car rotate a little bit better in the mid corner. There's also a track mode that gives an even 50-50 split fore and aft, but it's really not that useful on road. Our preferred setting is the 30/70, and when you do bury the throttle coming out of the corners, it does help rotate the car a little bit, although its effect really is quite subtle given how planted this car really is. The Toyota's slot car-like character no doubt has a lot to do with the compliance of the suspension. So there's less vertical movement in the mid-corner than you find in the Hyundai, so the tyres grip down a little bit better and it's more settled. Fast and rewarding? You bet. But because it's not as lively and as frisky as the Hyundai, it doesn't really quite deliver the same kind of thrill factors, at least out on a twisty back road. Is that a bad thing? Well, not necessarily so, because the Toyota's character will appeal to certain kind of buyers. Other niceties is that the feel of this manual transmission is vastly superior to that offered in the i30N. I also think these seats are also more supportive and grippy, which brings us neatly to interior, so let's check that out. The word that really comes to mind when you first climb into the Corolla is solid. It's well built and there's a real richness to its execution. But it's certainly what you wouldn't call slick or overly fancy. A lot of the cabin is certifiably mainstream, and it's a little bit disappointing for a vehicle that wants for the sort of money it does. Some of it is in the plastics and the material choice, although it must be said that the suede used on the seats is very plush. Some of it is in the steering wheel, which is nowhere near as fancy as the one in the Hyundai, and looks like it was lifted out of your nana's Yaris. And from the average stitching on the dash to the ho-hum 8-inch infotainment touchscreen, there's a constant reminder that your big dollar investment is really for the running gear that's underneath the skin. But if fanciness isn't your bag, there is a lot to like with its chunky vibe, and the driver ergonomics are excellent. It's simple, but everything is made for purpose and easy to find. However, if you do want to activate its go faster modes, there is a bit of fiddling around when it comes to dials, switches and buttons. In terms of general execution, there could be a bit more sense of celebration and a few more frills to remind you that this is one very special Corolla. That said, the 12.3-inch full digital driver's screen is a nice inclusion that's not included in the Hyundai. A plus is that its unpretentious format is easy to settle into, not just when you're up for the rent, but when you're having a cruise. In fact, that the Corolla is unfatiguing and downright pleasant around town really is one of its strongest points. Right, let's check out the i30N. The Hyundai certainly has a racier feel than the Corolla, and it's fancier too, particularly these N-Light seats, which have these glowing N logos in the backrest. And as the i30N Premium with sunroof suggests, you do get lots of bells and whistles, including the glass roof. However, at its core, the design here is 5 years young, and a cursory glance suggests that it's not getting any younger. In fact, it looks a generation older here compared to the i30 Sedan N, and that's no surprise given that what is essentially the US Elantra N is a generation newer. Still, there's some nice old school charm with the i30N hatch interior, including the analog instrumentation. And despite its age, the 10.25-inch touchscreen infotainment system is much better than that smaller 8-inch system that's in the Corolla. Plus, you got a lot of that tricky data logging and telemetry that Hyundai's N division has loaded into this particular hot hatch. There's also a lighter and airier ambience in here than the chunky Corolla, and that's going to appeal to a lot of buyers. It's not terribly upmarket in some of the material choices, but like the Corolla, it does feel quite solid, which is a lot more to be said than the i30 Sedan N that I reviewed recently. Ergonomically, it's ready for battle, and the steering wheel is much better than the one in the Corolla, with all access to the drive modes and the action in easy to access buttons. In terms of fuel consumption on a cruise, both of these vehicles had similar fuel consumption of around the mid-8 mark. Neither are particularly frugal when you're up for the rent, but nor are they that thirsty given the performance that they offer. In terms of running costs, servicing for the Hyundai is $1,005 for the first 3 years or 30,000 kilometers. So you do need to service it every 10,000 kilometers. The Corolla though is quite a bit more expensive because it needs to be serviced every 6 months or 10,000 kilometers at $300 per visit. All up, the Corolla will cost you $1,800 over the first 3 years for servicing. In terms of warranty, both cars are covered by 5 years and unlimited kilometer use. From the moment that you turn a wheel in anger in either of these competitors, it's clear that both of them are out for serious go-fast business. And when you do let them off their leashes, each is fantastically capable and rewarding to drive, provided that you can find a fun and twisty road that's worthy of their collective talents. But what's really interesting is that back to back, they're very different animals from one another. And that goes well beyond cylinder count, what driven wheels they choose to use, and the types of gearboxes that they have. But given that neither is lesser when it comes to point-to-point pace, how do you separate them in a verdict? Well, the Corolla, for its part, is more broadly flexible and frankly, more easy to live with. But the Hyundai's fun factor is more accessible on a public road, even if it is tougher to live with as a daily driver. It's really horses for courses then, so picking the right one for you is really down to personal preference. However, that sounds an awful lot like fence sitting, and here we really need a verdict. Does the Corolla suffer for having the smaller 3-cylinder engine? No, it doesn't. And is there really any shortcoming to the Hyundai only using front-wheel drive? No, there isn't. Given they're so close in capabilities and performance, we have to give the win to the i30N purely on bang for buck factor. That near $9,000 savings that you get in the Hyundai is not to be sneezed at, and it will buy a lot of fuel and rubber that you will undoubtedly use in a red-hot ownership experience. Having said that, if you do have the extra skin for the Corolla, you will not be disappointed. The bad news is that both hatches are tough to get a hold of. At the time of review, Hyundai had put a stop on new orders until production could catch up with existing orders of the i30N hatch. As for the GR Corolla, Toyota Australia says that if you place an order, you might get one of the first 700 units allocated for the first year of sale, but there are no guarantees. For both, our advice is to skirmish the dealer network for your preferred hatch, as sometimes existing customer orders do fall through, occasionally freeing up stock. Well, that's what I think, but how about you? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe while you're at it, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.